book we're talking about today is Breaking Point. I like to think of this as the third part of the trilogy. These authors have written 2 other books together. The first one was called Empty Planet, which was a very insightful and early thinking about the population and demographic challenges on the horizon. They then wrote The Big Shift, which was talking about many of these trends becoming real. And of course, now the book that you're going to hear about today is The Breaking Point. We're going to hear about some policy failures. We're going to hear about postponed decisions that got us to where we are. And we're also going to hear about ideas for actions and new policy directions forward. So really looking forward to that. I do like the fact that the book also acknowledges that Canada exists in a global context. This is not us alone. We have to react to things around us and position ourselves. And I also like the fact that the book acknowledges that there is a major deep rift between generations right now in Canada, between a lot of the older generation who tends to make up a lot of the voting population and the younger generation, something to be addressed. So we're going to invite our 2 author speakers to come up now, and they're going to introduce the book for about 20 minutes, and then Vass will join them for the fireside chat after that. So John and Darrell, please come up to the stage, and welcome again.
Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you, everyone, for coming to hear from us today, and I hope to talk to us today. Just by way of a very quick introduction to how this book arrived, which is, as Paul says, something of a sequel. In 2013, we published a book called The Big Shift, and The Big Shift argued that a couple of big demographic and political shifts were underway. We talked about the fact that for most of Canada's history, something that we called the Laurentian consensus, the Laurentian elite, had governed Canada. And these were the kind of people in this room. These were the political, academic, bureaucratic, cultural, media elites in the cities, essentially from Windsor to Quebec City along the watershed of the St. Lawrence River. And we said that they had governed the country for most of the country's history. They had governed it mostly by consensus, but that big shifts were underway. And one shift was that the power and influence of the Western provinces was growing steadily. They were growing in population, they were growing in economic wealth, and they were shifting the political powers to the West, and in general, they were cohering around a conservative message rather than a progressive one. And then the second thing that was happening was that we had huge numbers of immigrants mostly from the developing countries living in suburbs. And these suburban immigrant voters voted for whoever formed the government. So we predicted that in something of a shift from everything that had happened in the past, now we were going to have a coherent conservative coalition based in the West. We were going to have a progressive coalition based in the city centers, and elections were going to be fought over suburban immigrant voters who would decide the outcome. And more or less that is what has happened. The West has continued to grow in influence. The Conservative coalition has remained coherent. The Progressives are still focused around a kind of a de facto Liberal NDP agreement. And in 15, 19, and 21, the Liberals won the popular vote once, and the Conservatives won the popular vote twice, but the Liberals were able to form minority governments. So, okay, the thesis seems to have borne fruit. We decided to have to do an essay for the Globe and Mail, actually almost about exactly a year ago, in which we said 2 things. The big shift continues to roll along. It's getting bigger and shiftier, and it is influencing the country's politics more and more, and the country's demographics more and more. So good for us. But we missed something. We missed the fact that as the big shift did roll along, it was placing intolerable strains on the country. And indeed, the country was coming to reach a breaking point. And part of it was demographic. Much of it was political. We had looked at our governing elites had failed to grapple with this issue, this issue, this issue, and this issue. And the metaphor that we've come up with after the book was out was that a wonderfully mixed metaphor was that we kicked so many cans down the road that now the chickens had come home to roost. And so, in that sense, Donald Trump was a catalyst. All of these things have been rolling along, not getting resolved. And then this president arrives and says, you don't really deserve to be a country. We can take your manufacturing sector away from you. We can substitute most of your imports. You really don't have anything to offer us. Why don't you just become a 51st state, because you're not really a country anyway. And that led to the existential challenge that we face today. A challenge that, strangely enough, Darrell found in a book that was published in the early 1960s.
Political science disclaimer. So I'm sure many of you have read George Grant's Lament for a Nation, one of the probably most seminal books in Canadian political philosophy. It's a really odd book, and I don't think has gone through time very well. And it doesn't really remain that current. But he asked one great question, and it really informed how I approached the topic that we worked on in Breaking Point, which is, are Canadians a unique species on the North American continent? And if we are a unique species on the North American continent, what makes us unique? And what are those institutional, cultural, and other things that we have to have in order to be a unique country, a unique species? And Donald Trump, sort of like the emperor's new clothes. Now, in this analogy, Donald Trump is not the emperor. But the Grimm's fairy tale is about a very egotistical king, or governor, or whatever you want to describe him as, or emperor, I guess as the title says, who constantly wants to refresh his clothes to be the most fashionable person going. And finally, the tailors that are working for him run out of costumes that they should give him, so they just say, basically, you should just show up naked. That's the most wonderful clothing that you could possibly have. Look at this amazing outfit. And they treat him like he's dressed, but he's obviously standing there naked. And there's this little kid in the story that stands up and says, am I nuts here? Am I the only person who can see that this person is naked? Well, Donald Trump's actually the little kid in the analogy. When he stood up and he basically said, you know what? You can't defend yourselves. Why don't you become part of this golden dome that we want to raise over North America, and you'll be the most secure people in the world. Oh, by the way, your prosperity is entirely dependent on one trading partner. And he's right. One trading partner. Over 70%, sometimes close to 80% of our trade goes over the north-south border to the United States. You're entirely dependent on us. You're not really a country. And by the way, and he actually did this, he held up a map of North America, and he said, this line here, it looks like somebody drew it with a ruler and a pencil. Like it's not even a real thing. Honestly, somebody did probably draw it with pick the 49th parallel and drew the line. But he said, for all of these reasons, there's no reason for you to exist. And so the book, and you can see the title is, the Breaking Point, the new big shifts putting Canada at risk, are about these cans and these chickens and what we need to do in order to deal with this situation so we can affirm that going into the future we do remain a unique species on the North American continent.
So there are lots of things we talk about in this book. We talk about foreign policy, defense policy, immigration policy, media, Indigenous Canadians, and also a very large chunk of the book which is dedicated to proposing solutions to these challenges. But there are two big rifts that define the crisis that we found ourselves in even before Donald Trump arrived, and that have now made things so much worse. And the first big crisis, do you want to do horizontal or do you want to do vertical?
You take your choice, John.
I'll do vertical, you do horizontal.
Okay, you do vertical, I'll do
So the first one is regional alienation, the horizontal crisis.
So Canada, and this is something that we forget because we talk about the nation state all the time. I think a lot of people assume that we're a unitary state. I think the federal government often assumes that we're a unitary state, and we're not. We're a confederation. We are a federation that came together in the 1860s, principally in a similar kind of moment to the one that we're in now, in which a threat from the southern border asked the question of all of the colonies that were on the 49th side, the northern side of the 49th parallel, would you prefer to be part of something new, or would you prefer to be part of the United States? And John A. Macdonald and the Fathers of Confederation, it would be different now, there would be Mothers of Confederation as well, but back at that time, fathers only, decided that they could compromise. A glass half full for everybody was better than a full glass that was in the United States. So they came together and they actually put together this nation that we now celebrate that has done so well in the world, Canada. So, but over the years, the tensions between the federation, in the federal system that we have become more difficult to deal with. And we're dealing with some, for example, right now that we never really dealt with in the past, like Western Canada. And the big shift of population to the West, both in terms of political and economic power, has created a situation in which there's a lot of tension between, we shouldn't just call it the West, it's actually the West, but principally between Alberta and Saskatchewan and the federal government. You're going to see some of it play out this Thursday when they talk about a new, possibly, pipeline that they're going to build through British Columbia, probably to British Columbia's objection, which shows the Federation operating as it does. But at the same time, we're going to be going through a situation starting next year in which we're going to be running through a ramp up into a provincial election in the province of Quebec. It looks right now like the Parti Québécois could very likely win that election. They've got a current double-digit lead in the polls, and they have committed to having a referendum on sovereignty in their first term. So this will be the first time in Canadian political history in which we could potentially have two referenda taking place at the same time. And so the job of the federal government is to find a way to reconcile all of these interests in a way that previously they didn't do through basically public spending and executive federalism, and trying to find a way to recognize the needs and the opportunities that exist within the provinces collectively in the decision-making that we have in this country. So far, it's eluded very many governments, probably operated better under Stephen Harper in the modern era than it's operated under anybody else. But certainly after the Trudeau administration, and we're not particularly charitable to the Trudeau administration in the book, but there's three things that every government is evaluated on in history, Canadian government, Canadian Prime Minister. How'd you run the economy? How'd you leave national unity? And how'd you handle our relationship with the United States? Now, that doesn't mean that Justin Trudeau didn't have some successes in other areas, but in those three big existential areas, they're the ones that history remembers you for, and all three of them were lesser. And the one that's going to become very problematic in probably a short period of time, the next year to 18 months, is the one that relates to keeping Canada together, which is the horizontal cleavage. So, John, you want to talk about the vertical one?
And you've already heard the introduction to the vertical component. So if we have regional alienation unlike we've ever seen before, and that's no small feat in the country, we also have, for the very first time, a generation of young workers and students who are, for the first time in the life of this country, likely not to live as well as their parents lived. But some people say, well, what about the Great Depression? Actually, my parents lived through the Great Depression. They were young people during the Great Depression. And yes, they were incredibly poor. But then came the Second World War, and then came the post-war boom. And by 1950, they were living better than anyone had ever lived before. And every generation has promised this, to work hard, do what you need to do, contribute to your community, and you will be able to afford a house or a home of some kind. You'll be able to afford to have children. You will have some kind of security, well-paying job. The boomers and the Gen Xers managed to shatter that. And they did it in a number of ways. And again, sometimes, like hell is always, the road to hell always is, it was paved with good intentions. They introduced regulations and restrictions that made it more and more difficult for municipalities to build affordable housing. They wanted to make sure that they had all of the pensions and health care and home care services that they needed as they aged. So they put all those programs in place. But of course, who was going to pay for it? Well, the smaller population of millennial and Gen Zs were going to have to work even harder in order to pay for what the boomers, that would be me, wanted. They felt they wanted it needed, and there were and a bunch of other things too. And then on top of everything else that they had done, the governments of the last 10, especially the Liberal government of the last 10 years, committed a sin that will mark it down as one of the greatest policy failures in the history of the country. They broke immigration. And that's a tragedy, an absolute tragedy. This was always our competitive advantage. Canada, from around 2000, most polls showed that Canadians supported high levels of immigration. They had watched it happening. Mulroney started it. The Chrétien and Martin governments kept it going. Stephen Harper kept it going as well. So it was a liberal conservative consensus. Bring in about 250,000 people a year. Bring them in from around the world on a point system so that they can contribute to our economy. Bring them in through the university and college system so that they get a good education, can speak English and French, and then go straight to work into our workforce, where they will pay taxes for decades before they start to actually draw stuff out from the system, and bring in a compassionate number of asylum seekers who are genuinely fleeing persecution. Put that all together, and you have the multicultural world that Canada has created since the late 1980s, and that we had right up until just a few years ago. And then the Trudeau government decided on a couple of things. First of all, they decided to increase the permanent resident status from 250 to 500,000. And frankly, that probably was not a bad idea. The country was growing. We needed more people. Labor shortages were emerging through an aging society. And ramping up permanent residence was probably not a bad idea. And then they completely lost all control over the temporary foreign workers and over the international students programs. And asylum seekers began flooding across the border, essentially economic refugees rather than true persecuted refugees claiming asylum. And all of a sudden, Statistics Canada said, hey, did you know there are 3 million people in this country that nobody knew were here? And we didn't know they were here. I mean, the federal government knew the programs were running, but they had lost all track and all control over immigration. And although they weren't the first, and of course the immigrants themselves were in no way responsible for this, and although there were already pre-existing pressures, God knows, their arrival, they competed with younger workers for wages, they competed for housing spaces, they competed for health care, and so you had a situation in which a young person today many of them cannot expect to ever own a home, certainly not the home that they wanted, the 3-bedroom house with a bit of backyard, pretty hard to get now. A defined benefit pension plan, they don't even know what it is. You have to explain it to them because they're never going to see one. And they live inside a gig economy, and they are very angry. And they have every reason to be angry. And they are angry at us, at me, and my generation. And so just as we have Donald Trump arriving and saying, you're not a real country, and just as we have all of these tensions regionally in the West and in Quebec, so you also have great tensions between the generations, such that when Donald Trump says, you're not a real country, and if we make a good offer, do you want to come join the United States? Polls show 40%, I believe.
No, it was 45.
45% of people under the age of 35 said, make us a good enough offer and we would seriously consider it. And that is the kind of tension that not even tension, the cleavages that we face today that put Canada at a breaking point. And there's some other stuff too. You want to do defense and foreign policy? Sure.
Well, I'm going to steal a phrase.
You'll notice we tend to riff.
Steal a phrase that John came up with, which is defense policy is trade policy, is foreign policy, and you can just interact. It's like a triangle. And there was a time after the Second World War when Canada did have a serious defense policy. I mean, we fought 2 serious global wars in the 20th century, and Canada, I hate the phrase punched above its weight, but in those instances did. I mean,
I hate to interrupt, but raise your hand if you knew that Canada had an aircraft carrier and its escorts in 1970. I see one hand. That's how many people knew that in 1970 this country had an aircraft fleet. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, and I actually saw it. I was living in Nova Scotia back in the 1970s and saw it go under the bridge, the Bonnie go underneath, and it was a spectacular thing to see, the Bonaventure. Scrapped and sold for razor blades, I think, in Korea. But since the 1970s, every government, and so it's not just an ideological thing, a party thing, has basically said, you know what, we like this idea of being free riders on security. In fact, the Americans are going to take care of it. NATO is going to take care of it. We're going to look for the minimum amount that we could possibly commit to our defense and security because we're going to invest this in other things. And that's what we did. The Liberal government under Trudeau did it. Trudeau won. Brian Mulroney, at least it was at 2% through the period that he was there. And then as we went through the deficit period with Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin, it came down. Stephen Harper, I don't think ever got to 2% when he was Prime Minister.
Nope.
And Justin Trudeau was well short of that. Donald Trump is right about this. A country that cannot defend its territorial integrity, it's very hard to describe it as a country. And the argument that we make in the book is unless you can demonstrate that to the world, why would they take you seriously when it comes to foreign policy? Why would they take you seriously when it comes to trade policy? There's no reason to. Why do we not get invited to join, and even though we are a Pacific nation, the new relationship between, by the way, the UK, which is odd because it's not a Pacific nation, the US and Australia when it comes to defense issues in Australia, and in the Pacific, because what do we have to bring to the table? We really have nothing. And so when you get into this kind of situation, you have to say to yourself, we need a new investment in our military. We need to protect our territorial integrity. We need to be able to project our importance into the world. Now, for this Prime Minister Carney has said that he's going to commit to it. He's certainly said that we're going to get to 2%. But one thing I think we say in the book, well, I know we say in the book that is really important, it's not about the percentage. It's about the capability. Can you actually defend your territorial integrity? And more the pressure is going to come in our Arctic area. It's going to come in the north. Because if you accept that climate change is occurring and that the polar ice cap is going to be melting, that now becomes a transit point for anybody who wants to ship over the top of the globe. There are resources up there that we claim as part of our territory, along with the indigenous communities up in that area, that if we don't have the ability to project our national sovereignty into those places, other people are going to take them, including quite possibly the United States. So I think that this is a legitimate question to ask. What are we going to do on our defense? And we can't be free riders on the United States anymore because they have become an unreliable participant in even Western security. I just spent the weekend in Halifax at the Halifax International Security Forum, and it was shocking to hear the conversations from people all over the world about the absence of the United States and how everybody else is now facing very seriously this similar question.
And we're supposed to talk for about 20 minutes, and that was about 2 minutes ago.
Was it?
Yeah. So we're gonna make this last bit very, very short. There's a lot in the book about how we can lessen the strains of intergenerational wealth. There's a lot in the book about how we can restore confidence in the media, and how we can affect reconciliation with First Nations, and lots of other things too. I'm going to name one thing, and you're going to name one thing, okay, and then we're going to get out of here. So one thing that we suggest is that people living in different parts of the country have to see themselves reflected in the federal government, and they don't. The federal government exists in Ottawa. It's populated by people mostly who were born and raised in Eastern Ontario or Western Quebec, and it reflects that consensus. So we want to take every department in Ottawa out of Ottawa that's not federal, that's not exclusively federal. So defense stays, justice stays, Bank of Canada stays, criminal, all that kind of stuff stays. But anything that's related with joint provincial or affairs gets moved out. We suggested putting fisheries in Halifax. We wanted to put Parks Canada in Banff. If not, maybe Canmore. We wanted to put the Heritage Department in Saskatoon, because it would be a big thing if the Canada Council were in Saskatoon. They think very differently if they were in Saskatoon. And we know, because of the virtual technology now, that we can hold cabinet meetings. So you don't just move the public servants out, you move the whole department out, the ministers out there, the deputy ministers out there. And so the federal government, whenever that cabinet meets, partly virtually, would find itself saying, you may say that in Toronto, but I'm telling you right now in Regina, they're thinking something completely different. And then the other side of it is that people in those communities, in the West, in the Maritimes, would see the government reflected. It's there. It's in their community. Its minister is in there with them. And we think that would do a lot to lessen the horizontal challenges that we face. And you want to do constitutional reform in 1 minute?
Yes, 1 minute.
What constitutional reform in 1 minute?
Okay, so Paul, I'm just hoping there's a defibrillator somewhere in this. We want to open up the Constitution. And for one really big reason, we need to get rid of the Senate. If I hear one more person say to me, it is this chamber of sober second thought, it was never designed for that purpose. It is not. It is, as they say, the taskless thanks. But the Senate needs to be abolished. It is not the House of the regions, the House of the provinces that it was designed to be. It's irrelevant in Canadian politics. Our recommendation is that we take the Council of the Federation and we make it a real decision-making body. By the way, you've seen it in very good action over the space of the last 8 months as we've tried to respond to the threat from Donald Trump, in which we've had different provinces chair it. We had Doug Ford chairing it for a bit. I don't know who's chairing it now. But the federal government should be at the table, and it should be an actual, real decision-making body in which the Federation comes together. Everything that we do to promote the Federation that we have reduces the regional tensions that we talk about in this book. Because the thing that I'm most worried about is not Quebec separating. I don't think that that's realistic, or Alberta separating, but possibly maybe the United States and Donald Trump making a great offer to the province of Alberta about maybe moving them in as the 51st state rather than the entire country. And not only could that possibly happen, the bigger thing is that we will be talking about it forever as we're trying to work out all these other issues in terms of vertical cleavages in our country. So we want to open up the Constitution, we want to abolish the Senate, and we want to create the Council of the Federation as a true decision-making body.
And maybe in the Q&A we can talk about the things we want to do vertically too, in terms of wealth transfers from my generation to younger people, in terms of making education easier for younger people, and in terms especially of making young men who feel increasingly alienated and disconnected from the society, reintegrating them back into that society. These are all huge challenges. There's no question about it. But we end the book optimistically, I think, because we are optimists and patriots. We do believe, in spite of everything, it's one of the great countries in the world, still maybe the greatest. And the point is that we have met these challenges in the past. As Darrell said, we met the challenge of annexation in 1867 by confederating rather than annexing. We built a transcontinental railway, a much more difficult one than the Americans ever had, with far fewer resources than they had. We fought in 2 world wars, such that our enemies in both wars feared Canadian troops more than any other in the Allied forces. We built the seaway, we built all the infrastructure and the welfare state. We contained and overcame the challenge of separation and referendums, not once but twice. And when COVID arrived, we had one of the lowest mortality rates in the world. We can do these things. The only thing we need to understand is, here are the challenges. No more can kicking. We have to address them. We have to address them now. It may involve compromise. It may involve a cup half full, but we can't not answer these challenges, or we could lose the country. But we don't think we will lose the country. We think that we will rise to this challenge. All we need to do is get to work. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Vass.
Thank you so much. We're going to get to work. Thank you so much to CIGI for hosting. Thank you, Paul, for the wonderful introduction. If I'm a Laurentian elite, I noticed you called everyone in the audience or listening a Laurentian elite.
We're traitors to our class.
I was going to say I'm the pencil crayon kind. Love Saskatoon. Very interested in hearing how you can transfer some of your wealth to me. But before we get there, maybe we could just touch on, we're at a think tank, we're on a campus, and I think it might be lovely to hear just very briefly, you have a wonderful dynamic, you have an intellectual intimacy that is for many years now. What has it been like writing this book together? How do you approach your thinking? 2 heads are better than one.
For me personally, John will obviously speak for himself. It's always a great opportunity to really stretch your mind. And it's funny, people think that the way people write together is that they, get a writer's cabin and they go away in the woods and they sit together for 3 months and they work on a book. That's not John and I. Basically what happens is we come up with a great idea. He either sells me on his idea or I sell him on my idea.
So step one, come up with a great idea.
Yeah, you have to come up with a great idea. And a great idea to me is one that's worth investing 6 months, 8 months, 2 years of your time in learning about. Because the journey is actually the best part of the whole thing, working out how you think and learning new things as you go through it. But basically what we do is we agree on an outline. And then it's like picking your baseball team or picking your hockey team, where you throw the sticks in the middle of the ice and you go up and you grab this guy's stick, okay, he's on your team, and you grab that guy's stick, he's on your team. So we pick the ones that we really like, each of us like as chapters from the outline, and then there will be a couple at the end where we'll maybe talk a little bit about back and forth, but it doesn't last very long. And then we'll assign them, and then we'll just get writing independently. And then what happens is we exchange material. John usually has a lot more comments on what I've written than I have on what he's written. But usually my comments are of the nature of, this is a great story, but the data don't necessarily sustain it. And John's comments are, this is boring, and we can tell a better story because he's a wonderful storyteller. So that's what happens. And then what happened with this book, there was at least one chapter that came up at the end, which is, oh man, now that we've gone down this road for a while, there's this one thing that's hanging out there. Can it be a section of a chapter, or does it need its own chapter? And that came up, and so we added an additional chapter to the book. But that's typically what happens. We don't talk very much. We maybe, a couple times a week we'll maybe ping each other, but that's how it works.
And there was one difference, and it's perfectly true. So first of all, you need to like and trust each other. Secondly, you need to think along the same lines.
Yeah.
So we don't fight it out and reach consensus. 90% of the time we agree on almost everything. The conversation may be, you're putting too much emphasis on this. No, you're putting too much emphasis on that. That's easy to fix. The one big difference, though, was between Big Shift and Breaking Point on the one hand and Empty Planet on the other. So with Big Shift and Breaking Point, I believe that it was incredibly important that we write the book in 6 months and that the publisher publish the book in 6 months. And anybody who knows the publishing industry knows that is an extraordinary challenge. But the political world is ephemeral. And if you spend 2 or 3 years working on a politics book, by the time the book comes out, things have already moved on. So with Big Shift, I said, we write it in 6 months, and you have it out, and they did. And when it was actually Darrell said we should turn that essay back into a book, and I said okay, but it has to be 6 months, 6 months. And we took it, and in fact, Colin Stewart grabbed it instantly. So we started writing on the middle of, I think it was the 15th of December was day one, and the 6th of June we transmitted the manuscript, and the 20th of October it was published. So that's an extraordinary feat. Don't think that happens, or
as you have jobs too.
As we had jobs at the same time. And on top of, but Empty Planet was different. It was a contrarian thesis. We were saying, because we had been studying this for years, both of us independently, that population growth was not the issue. Population decline was the issue. That fertility rates were declining. Nobody believed this, except for a few institutes, and a few demographers, and a few statisticians who said, "Yeah, you're right." In fact, they had been studying it themselves. So we traveled around the world for that. We were in every continent except Antarctica, where there's not a big problem with fertility decline. And
penguins.
We talked to demographers, we talked to statisticians, we talked to professors, but mostly we talked to young people, and especially we talked to young women. Brought them together, went into slums in New Delhi and university campuses in South Korea, and talked to you. Why aren't you having babies? Why do you not plan to have babies? And if there's any, and then so that book took several years and a tremendous amount of research before we were ready to be really the first book in the world that said population decline is the thing, not population growth. And that one went from "Are you out of your mind?" to conventional wisdom in the space of about 3 years. I guess the only thing that we would have, that all three books have in common, apart from the fact that we wrote them, is that I like to think all three books focus relentlessly on the people on the ground. We do not write for political elites. We're not interested in convincing people in the university that were right. We really want to have, and we do believe that arguments, demographic, political, cultural, social, should be arguments that you fight out in the coffee shop, in the Tim Hortons, around the table. And we write books for those people. We write books for people to argue about when they're with friends and colleagues, not to tell deputy ministers what they should do next.
Well, let's fight it out a little bit. No, I'm half kidding. You have a lot of truths in this book, right? It's a very honest book.
Depends on your perspective, yes.
Yes. Let me read one. Canada is not a love story. It's a marriage of convenience, a survival strategy conceived a century and a half ago for a collection of colonies that were determined to protect their autonomy from America's manifest destiny. You've touched on this major shift, immigration in Canada, how our perhaps love affair or how that had characterized Canada is changing and shifting. And when you were just on stage now, you mentioned the temporary foreign worker program and universities and international students. You not blamed, but you sort of put the blame squarely on the capital G government for this. How do we think about businesses that may have been claiming to the government they needed temporary foreign workers, or the post-secondary institutions that may not have been complaining about the extra revenue they were making from students? How do we understand that shift more broadly in Canada?
Well, I think first of all, it's not up to the businesses or the post-secondary institutions to police these things. It's up to the government. And if the rules that are established allow them to do those kinds of things, then they're going to do them. And so I don't necessarily blame the businesses for that. I do blame the post-secondary education system to a certain extent because, even here in our, this is where I'm from Kitchener-Waterloo, what happened at Conestoga College is a little difficult to justify. But we have a post-secondary institution system in this country that could be a really important part of what our future is going to be, but it's not going to be educating the baby boom, which it was designed to educate, because we don't have a baby boom. Our birth rate this year is 1.26, and it's probably going to fall down below. It's currently at its lowest in history, and it's going to fall even lower. And there's no break in that pattern. We've not really seen it anywhere else in the world, so it's going to continue to decline. So those resources are going to need to be deployed in a way that's going to be effective in our economy and in terms of particularly the knowledge economy that we're dealing with. But that doesn't mean that we're going to spend all of that institutional capacity in educating foreign students. It's a ridiculous thing. So I think, at some point we're going to have a serious conversation about that. But ultimately, it's the government, it's the federal government that polices this, that sets the rules, sets the conditions, and the other actors act within the context of those rules. Now, they can lobby for certain things, but the government doesn't have to say yes. It chose to say yes.
Yeah, I think just as an illustration of that, when the whole thing blew up, Justin Trudeau did a video, of course.
Right.
Because when things blew up, Justin Trudeau did a video. And he talked about why they had increased temporary foreign workers and why they had increased international students because of the aging society and the labor shortages. But he said, then certain bad actors, such as big box stores, took advantage of the system. No, they didn't. Big box stores or Amazon or chains or whatever went to the government and said, could we please bring in hundreds of thousands, even millions of temporary foreign workers who will work for a much lower wage than Canadians could possibly afford to live in, given our standard of living and our housing costs? And the federal government said, sure. They're not to blame. If a corporation says, would you please allow us to bring in workers at low wages because we don't want to pay the kind of wages that Canadians require, and the federal government says, take all the workers you want. It's not the corporations that are to blame, it's the government that let those workers in. And if young people are furious with the fact that they're not, even as there are labor shortages in some areas, they can't find work in secure, well-paying jobs because there are so many temporary foreign workers competing with them for jobs. Again, it's not the young people that are to blame. It's not the temporary foreign workers that are to blame. It's the government that allowed that to happen.
We also have a government who's encouraged firms of all sizes to adopt more productivity enhancing technology in the form of artificial intelligence. We are starting to see some early indicators that AI may be substituting away or causing firms to delay hiring new grads or nurturing that new talent. Where would you put the kind of shift or growth in the digital economy that's occurred over the 12 years between the two books? How do we layer that into Breaking Point? But it also strikes me that some of this, the fissure, some proportion stoking these divides in Quebec, but also out west, could be a function of digital foreign interference and mis and disinformation. I'm kind of lumping multiple questions into two.
I know.
How do we think about digital in one?
Let me pick question 3 of that.
Sure.
And ignore all the rest. Look, one of the things that governments have done, especially liberal governments have done, this is not really a book that's sort of, pro-conservative and anti-progressive. I think you'll find that large chunks of the book are quite progressive. But in the last 10 years, we had a government that decided that the best way to solve all of the challenges that you put forward was to adopt an industrial strategy. We traditionally took things out of the ground and sold them to the south. We cut things down and sold them to the south. We sent things by truck and rail and pipeline. We're not going to have any of that. We're going to have a new industrial strategy that focuses on digital, that focuses on AI, that focuses on this and focuses on that. We're going to put together these $100 billion programs in order to finance this and to kickstart it. And I'm, until just very recently, was in the Ottawa Bureau of the Globe and Mail, and I can tell you that the budget every year was the same. The budget would come out and there would be some big new thing, superclusters or Asian Development Bank or whatever they had decided was the big new thing. And there would be all this money that would be flowing in to this new strategy to kickstart this, to develop that, to make that happen. And that would be the headlines for the story. And then if you looked about 2 or 3 chapters in, you'd see, by the way, the previous 3 initiatives of the previous 3 budgets, we are now quietly ratcheting down because none of it worked. So we don't think industrial strategy works. We think you create a fundamental environment to encourage people to go to school and get educated. You create an environment that makes it easy to access capital and to transfer wealth. Again, you reduce as much as possible to the bare minimum of what is health and safety, the regulations, the limit development, and then you just let the market get on with it. In the long run, we think that would work better.
Yes, you write that Canada is a resource economy trying to pretend that it's something else. You also focus in that commentary on regulation, government as a regulator. I wonder if we might be slightly overlooking private actors as de facto regulators of mostly the digital economy that Canada is trying to navigate like everyone else, but also with a form of weaponized interdependence right now. I mean, when we have the Mag 7 explicitly wanting to seek dominance over Canada, there's territorial defense, and then I think there are other forms of economic defense that may spark or are sparking some of the important industrial conversations we're having now. How do we start to think about those gaps or those shifts or those opportunities for Canada, if at all?
Well, I think there's a need to get together with, because Canada can't do this on its own. I mean, there's a need to get together with international actors, like, for example, the European Union, which has been more aggressive on regulatory aspects of this than anybody, and the United States government, if and when they change, to try and deal with some of these things. But this gets back to the point that John and I talk about in the book. Defense policy is trade policy is foreign policy. Mm-hmm. And we don't get to participate in this game unless we take our own defense seriously. So the 2 biggest threats that Canadians see to our security are actually hacking and disinformation. So they're already, the funny thing is, it's like, oh, we're worried about the war that's going to happen. It's already happening. It's happening in your hand. and Canadians feel that they're participating in it. There's something that we can do from a defense and security perspective that might answer some of the questions that you're talking about, but what it requires us to do is rethink about how we're investing in our defense and what our defense capabilities are going to be. So I think there's an opportunity here where we can become more of a global player in this space by understanding what it is that the public thinks are the true defense threats, and then developing a capability here. You know what we don't need in the military as much anymore? People who can dig holes and shoot guns. We need people who can deal with these kinds of things. But our entire military infrastructure has no way of absorbing the talent in Canada to participate in that. And we know that there's a lot of people who want to do this and want to participate in some form of national service, and we have to create an opportunity for them to do this, like places like, for example, Finland have worked out.
30-second addendum, no more.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, we have to worry about foreign interference in technology, in digital, cybersecurity, intellectual electoral processes. But we also have to diversify. We haven't for generations. We've just been lazy and let everything go south. So that means trading with China. That means trading with India. If we only trade with countries that adopt all of our values, our entire trading relationship would be limited to Holland and possibly Denmark. So we have to live in this real world. And we have to remember this, and this is a good place to end this section, I hope. This is about a couple in their early 30s or late 20s in a suburb outside Vancouver or Calgary or Toronto or Halifax or Montreal.
KW.
They are trying to get a house.
Yeah.
They are trying to maybe have a baby. They would like to have a backyard so they can have a barbecue. They would like to have a secure job. And they would like to have some kind of hope that when they reach their 60s, there will be a pension program available to let them move into their retirement. That's all that counts. Nothing else counts. Everything that happens at CIGI, everything that happens at this university, everything that happens in Ottawa, that's all that counts, giving those people that life. And you should filter everything through the question, is what we're doing promoting the possibility of those people having a better life?
Let's wind down there and just sort of ask, with stitching that together and that arc for young people of today and the future of Canada, do you want to pull forward anything from your policy conclusions or other elements that have come up on tour, sort of your wild cards for budget 2026?
Well, I'll give you a wild card, and everybody's going to be dealing with it, and that is wealth transfer.
Yep.
It's not an opportunity for governments to enrich themselves. We've got to take away that idea. All of the wealth sits with our older population. All of the best real estate sits with our older population. We have to find a way for people to voluntarily help the next generation without being punished for doing it. So we're very strongly advocate in the Big Fix chapter, which is the last part of the book, that we need to put in place mechanisms. And by the way, we may have to invent some of them because there aren't a ton of them in the world, to allow that to happen in a voluntary way.
Yeah, and again, I always try to take it into the communities. We have all sorts of recommendations for how to do a wealth transfer, and to not get in the way, for governments to stop trying to tax or limit wealth transfer. Because I don't know what's happening in KW, but I know that where I live in Ottawa, the people in my generation, my friends, my peers, they are all of them doing the same thing: liquidating assets, selling the cottage, cashing in the retirement bonds, because they need to give a down payment to their children. Otherwise, those children will never be able to afford a home. They're the bank of mom and dad. The only way kids get a house these days is if mom and dad do it. We have to make it easier for them to do it. But we also have to remember there are a lot of people who can't sell the cottage, who can't cash the bonds. So what are we going to do for them?
Thank you. And I haven't gone to our audience questions. I will say, Michael, thank you for your question. I think we sort of answered it. Sorry, Trevor, I think we've answered your question. Michael just wants to pick up on something on defense, if that's okay, for our virtual audience. He notes that there are dozens of countries around the world that cannot defend themselves on their own from a large-scale attack at minimum. So maybe he's not thinking cyber, but maybe he is. Could you speak a little bit more about what makes Canada unique on this front?
Well, what is especially unique is that we've had the capability to defend ourselves, and we decided to give it away. So that's what makes it unique. We also have a large population. Granted, we have huge space that we have to be able to defend, but the principal requirement is one probably in our north rather than on our southern border. And with a bit of focus and a bit of investment, we could probably become credible and able to do that. I mean, if you're in Estonia, you can't defend yourself against the Russians unless you're in alliance with a bunch of other people. We could also be in alliance, but we have a primary responsibility, and that's to defend our northern situation. Plus, also participate in a meaningful way in our international relationships. Things like, for example, like NATO and other things. So I actually don't think it's that big a stretch. I think it's Canada sits in a very clear place. It's really clear what needs to be done. What we seem to lack is the organization and the will to get it done.
And just in case you think, boy, this is a conservative argument, not necessarily at all, unless you think Mark Carney's a conservative, but that's a completely different topic. But, I mean, a lot of the things in the big shift the current Liberal government is implementing, and that includes not only infrastructure for resources, but it includes, for the first time since Pierre Trudeau was Prime Minister, a robust reinvestment in defense, immediately up to 2% of GDP, and apparently up to 5%. Now, let's see the contract signed. Let's see the submarines purchased. Let's see the jets flying. Let's see the expanded reserves in place and all those other things. Let's see it actually happen, because procurement is the curse. But right now, if you look at what we say has to happen in terms of defense and foreign policy and trade, and you look at what the Carney government is doing in terms of defense and foreign policy and trade, we should sue them for stealing from us.
John, thank you. Darrell, thank you. And thank you to our audience.